how video games affect people. It affects the children because that's who it's designed to affect primarily, at least initially, to wean them on it and make them grow up with this ability to just kill that target on command. That's what it's all about. It's designed, these programs, by the military industrial complex. And they came out really as far back as the 1950s and 60s, and definitely stepped up in the 70s. Before they gave the internet to the public, they had meetings in the main war departments in various European countries, but mainly in the United States, in the Pentagon, to do with how they could keep prolonged warfare going with generations of youngsters who were growing up, who were perhaps disinhibited towards going to war. And they saw that with the problems with Vietnam. Some of the present players that also belong to the New American Century organization are now in power. And the same players back then were involved with think tanks on ways to encourage youngsters to get back into a war-type mode, to breed up generations who would be gung-ho for war and who would be desensitized enough and kept immature enough, basically, that they wouldn't see those enemies as targets, and they also wouldn't think of themselves as being killed. Now, if every young person who went to the military had a guarantee they were going to be killed, I guarantee you'd have nobody in the military, like someone with an extreme death wish. And so they came up with video games as a way for desensitizing the public, because they foresaw this war against movements, big movements that were forming, first scattered movements, independent from each other, to do with rights and civil rights and human rights and so on. They saw this ongoing war against these groups, and if they got their own way, eventually they'd take down this kind of system and bring in a different system. And they slapped everyone with the label of communist. Because in reality, we've been run by an oligarchy for a long, long, long time. An oligarchy, as Carroll Quigley said in his book Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American establishment. And I'm talking about how video games were designed to create generations of people who would eventually become soldiers, because the games were initially used to desensitize recruits in the military long before we heard of computers and so on. And in fact, you can go back into the records of the training manuals of the U.S. Army. There's only one instance. They'd already done it in Europe for centuries, and the U.S. had to copy their methods, but they were using methods long, long ago to desensitize recruits, and so that they'd kill more efficiently, because they found out, even as far back as the Civil War, that in some of the major battlefields, maybe only 17 out of every 100 actually fired their muskets, the ones who were dead. And they'd pick up these muskets on the field and check if they were fired or not. So they were deciding ways that they could actually train people and create a war type of culture, so they could always recruit ongoing, if need be, with every generation. And this was a stepped up, especially after and during the Vietnam era. It's no news today that they're going into using drugs on the military to create the new type of drug-induced aggressive soldier. They've tried that out. They tried that back in Vietnam with particular drugs. You see the movie called Jacob's Ladder. It's well worth seeing, because the drug they mentioned in there that they sprayed from helicopters was actually used in Vietnam. It was designed initially to make them very, very aggressive, and they tried it on monkeys first of all before they tried it on soldiers, and the monkeys literally ripped their limbs off each other. And this is the sort of thing the military's into, because they don't care about the average trooper. That's just to get them in as recruits. They just want you to go off and kill people. And if you get killed on the way, you're just a number anyway. There's always another one to come on behind you. So they used video games, initially created for the military, put together by psychologists and professionals and tremendous understanding of the human mind, with histories to back it all up too, of warfare techniques and so on, and what gets imprinted on your brain. And imprinting is very important with games, and with other things too. Ask the advertising industry, sex sells, for instance, and you mix sex with violence, and you certainly have got quite the combination there, because all the primitive aspects in the limbic system come to the surface and manifest themselves. And this is all really well understood in the high sectors of the military in all countries. And there are people, lots and lots of people, who are employed by government agencies who are working hand in glove with the makers of these big violent video game, mainly from Japan. Japan's a big player. They lead the field in altering the cultures of people. They have specialists in all different mental health areas working on these things. And it really is U.S. companies and British companies and other international companies that are based in Japan that take the lead and then market it to the children. And what do you tell relatives and friends when they do what everyone else does, and that's buy your child one of these games for birthdays or Christmas? Or what do? Do you accept it and let them do it, or do you ignore what your child does anyway? Most will just simply ignore it, thinking everyone's doing it, so it must be all right. But these games are literally meant to desensitize your children from killing and the acts of killing. Indoctrination is pretty intense, and again, whatever becomes tradition becomes the norm, and it becomes almost sacred. Culture, everything is all becomes sacred to an extent, because the masses, remember, so you're living with people, 80% are called the mass man. Right. They enjoy the masses. They like all to agree on the same major things, and they don't like anyone that's different than themselves. And if we're all told to wear orange pajamas tomorrow in the streets, and it became the normal, they'd start stoning someone who
had been black.
Exactly. So this is how it works. It's the same thing. In pre-Christian times, the people in Greece, when they worshipped the goddess and so on, used to kill often their firstborn child. And that was a normal thing. And Christianity came in, and at the first generation, suddenly you have to love your child, and they were stoning the ones that were going the old tradition by killing the firstborn. So anything can be made normal, and Plato said this thousands of years ago. He knew the art of creating culture and altering culture, and he said that anything can be given to the people, even a completely different morality in one generation, and the last ones to know it's happened are those who live through it. They just adapt and adapt all the way through it and never question.
And that's what is so astounding to me, that people go through life and never question anything.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, they don't question religion. They don't question the so-called news. They don't question anything.
They don't. And Brzezinski said that. He said in his own book, Between Two Ages, it's worth reading, because he's a man who was working with the NSA, the National Security Agency. He was the top of all the big major institutions. He was into the high technology aspect of mind control, psychological control, and propaganda. And he said in his own book, he says, shortly a technique will be unleashed on the public, which they'll be completely unaware of. He says, but shortly they'll be unable to think for themselves or reason for themselves. They'll expect the media to do all their thinking and reasoning for them.
And that's exactly what has happened.
Yes.
You know, people turn on their 6 o'clock news, and that's, you know, well, I was told this on the news, whether it was Fox or CBS or NSA, you know, any of them.
Yes.
And they're taught, you know, just don't question it. Don't even look into that story or why they're saying what they're saying.
Yes. And it's true, because that's why they hire people and keep them until they're 80 years of age, because you grow up with them, and he becomes like a father figure, paternal figure, staring you in the eye every night at 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whatever time.
Right.
And you'd never suspect this man, this father figure that you've grown up with, could lie to you.
Yeah.
And that's why they pay them such big money to stay there.
But you know, Ellen, I guess I was lucky. My father worked for naval intelligence, and he told me from the get-go, it's an oxymoron.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I know. And I've known people even in naval intelligence on the lower orders that were given stuff to do with a form of programming that came across their desk to make them believe in things. Because the first person you must convince, who's going to go out to convince the public later on, are your operators themselves. They must believe that they really have a cause of what they've seen as true.